Hello, I am postmodern philosopher. I am here today to explain why King'sh Quesht is actually a representation of our postmodern society. Here we see the first scene from the first game, this screen which everyone remembers as the first time they saw a real proper adventure game. And here we already see the first question which so many people ask themselves for years. Why is Graham's skin yellow? I have often heard the idea that maybe this is somehow inspired by The Simpsons, but this is a historical impossibility. It can't be inspired by The Simpsons because the first episode of The Simpsons was in 1989, but this first King's Quest was originally released in 1984. So we see only one possibility. Graham is Asian and represents a growing xenophobia in the United States in the 1980s. But it doesn't stop there. We see immediately that Edward, the king, is black. Not only are the subjects of this seemingly European kingdom actually from what was then called the Orient, but even their king represents the most marginalized ethnic group in the world. This pattern continues with the enemies encountered in the game. The dwarf is obviously Muslim, perhaps representing a stereotype of Asians as small and thieving, while the ogre, of course, represents white flight. King's Quest thus represents the beginning of multiculturalism, multiracialism, the mixing of different races, and the social and political alienation and angst which they give rise to. But where the first King's Quest game hinted at social problems, King's Quests 2 and 3 are a teenage fantasy. Of course, the second game is all about Graham's quest to empty his balls. He sees a beautiful woman, he immediately sets out to marry her, whatever the cost might be. He doesn't care if he gets killed. It is a very macho fantasy in the same vein as 1980s action movies. But we have to ask ourselves, how old is Graham in this game? In the first King's Quest, we see that Graham's hair is already gray. Obviously, he is an older man by the time this series starts. Yet the hint book for King's Quest 6 tells us that Graham was, and I quote, a young man of barely 19 years. Clearly, this is the same trick used by anime, where girls who are 12 years old are always exactly 18 years old. They may have double D breasts or even larger. And of course, they are all nymphomaniacs who will have sex with you just for existing. But they are still 12, except that they are actually 18. Except they are really 12, of course. But no one will admit this. Sorry, I got too much cocaine. King's Quest 2 is thus a fantasy in that it gives us the chance to be an older man who suddenly becomes young again and gets to have sex with a beautiful young woman who is his age instead of his sugar baby. But there is no sex in King's Quest 2. As with many family films, of course, this is supposed to be family games, so you could not be like Leisure Suit Larry with yeah. So of course, as in many family films, the sex is of course implied. We know what will happen after the wedding, but there is no reference to it. The sexual tension is reserved for the next game, King's Quest 3, where there is this one scene between the young Alexander and his sister Rosella, in which he shows his buttocks to her. Now, many people will say they are brother and sister. It is disgusting. How can I be such a pervert to think that there is sexual tension between brother and sister? But in the game, it is both implied and permitted. And it even makes sense, because until that point, Alexander and Rosella had never seen each other. You need to grow up with your siblings to be disgusted by the idea of having sex with them. If you suddenly met a sibling whom you had never seen before, you could be sexually attracted to them and not find it disgusting. Perhaps only intellectually so, but not necessarily physically or emotionally. This is why I say that King's Quest 2 and 3 are both teenage fantasies. They allow us to live out our secret sexual fantasies, that secret attraction which all young boys develop when they go through puberty, within the context of a family-friendly adventure game, so that it's okay with the parents and the parents don't say, no, you can't play it. Now, what came next? Yes, King's Quest 4 was, of course, the first King's Quest game to introduce serious technical innovation. The graphics are better because of the improved graphics engine. The game allows for higher resolution graphic, allowing you to put more pixels on one screen. We can thus see that King's Quest IV represents increasing population. Just as more people are coming into the world, there is population explosion, baby boomers, more babies are being born every second. In the same way, there is an explosion of pixels on our screen, showing better scenes, better resolution, better breasts on Rosella. And this makes us feel good, because as we all know, the more the merrier. Just as we love to have more pixels on our screen, we are taught to love having more people in the world. So we can see, as we learn to love the pixel, so we learn to love ourselves. And after King's Quest IV, of course, was King's Quest V. And King's Quest V makes a significant change. As we know, this was the first game to have 256 color graphics instead of 16 colors. This continues the trend of the previous game, where first we had increasing population, now there are more colors, more diversity, and thus, of course, increasing racial diversity and integration. But King's Quest VI goes beyond technical improvements and becomes downright transgressive. Who can forget this scene? King's Quest VI features a scene of implied rape between a young woman and a minotaur, or minotaur, depending how you pronounce. But this would have been unthinkable in the first game in 1984. But as times become more permissive, so it becomes allowable to show a minotaur or minotaur standing over a young woman who is tied up in a pseudo bondage scene, which is still acceptable for children because it's still a family game. Now, as we all know, there is no King's Quest VII, and there is certainly no King's Quest Mask of Eternity. But if there had been a King's Quest VII, it would most likely have featured a sex scene between a human being and a creature who was no longer half human and half bull, like the Minotaur, but entirely a bull, or a horse, or maybe an owl, because of course we all know that there is this implied homosexual subtext between Graham and Cedric in King's Quest V. So, ultimately then, we can see that the King's Quest games were not only innovative for their style of gameplay and their technical development, they also represented social issues at the time they were released, and they show increasing permissiveness in society with passing of time. We look back on these games and it is like looking back on our own lives, that the history of our own world. Is there anyone who did not feel a twinge of desire upon first seeing Cassima in King's Quest V? We see and we understand Alexander, who was willing to risk his life for a pair of breasts. I mean, a woman whom he only saw one time. We feel through such experiences that not only do we understand these games, but also these games understand us. And that is why they have remained in our hearts through the years. So, keep questing, my friends.